There is a bridge in Scotland that has been trying to tell us something for 50 years. It stands in the estate of Overtoun House, near the town of Dumbarton, in the west of Scotland. It is made of granite. It is beautiful in the way that old things made by hand tend to be beautiful, heavy, deliberate, unmistakably permanent. It was built in 1895, in the Victorian style, arching gently over a small waterfall called the Overtoun Burn. The water below it falls about 15 meters onto the rocks. From certain angles, on certain days, it is one of the most peaceful places in Scotland. And since at least the 1950s, possibly earlier, dogs have been throwing themselves off it. Not stumbling. Not slipping. Not chasing something over the edge in an accidental moment of over-enthusiasm. Walking calmly to the parapet. Pausing. And jumping. The ones that survive sometimes climb back up the path and jump again. We do not know why. That is the beginning and the end of what we can say with certainty. Everything else, every theory, every investigation, every careful scientific attempt to explain what happens at the Overtoun Bridge eventually runs into the same wall. The wall of a dog that should not have jumped, but did. Tonight, we are going to walk to that bridge together. We are going to stand on it, in the grey Scottish light, and we are going to try to understand what it is. What it wants. Why, for more than half a century, it has been drawing dogs to its edge. We may not find an answer. But we are going to look. The estate of Overtoun sits at the edge of the Kilpatrick Hills, on the southern boundary of the Scottish Highlands. If you drive north out of Glasgow for 20 minutes, the city falls away and you enter a different kind of country, steeper, quieter, darker green. The hills here are not dramatic in the way that the highlands further north are dramatic. They are something older and more patient. They roll into fog. They hold their shapes in rain. In winter they turn the color of old iron, and the light that comes off them is the color of pewter, and you understand, standing in it, why the people who lived here for thousands of years before us built their entire cosmology around the idea that the world is full of things that cannot be seen. There is a quality to the west of Scotland that is difficult to describe to someone who has not been there. It is not the quantity of rain, though there is a great deal of rain. It is not the particular palette of greys and greens and purples that the landscape assembles in autumn and winter. It is something more like a relationship between the land and the sky, a compression, a weight, a sense that the atmosphere sits closer to the ground here than it does elsewhere, that the boundary between what is above and what is below is less distinct. The medieval scholars who mapped this coastline called it the edge of the world, and they were thinking in terms of geography, but there is another sense in which the phrase seems accurate. It is a place where certain categories of experience seem closer to the surface. The town of Dumbarton sits at the confluence of the River Leven and the River Clyde, about 25 kilometers west of Glasgow. It is an ancient settlement. The name derives from Dumbarton, the Gaelic for fortress of the Britons, and the rock that dominates the town has been occupied continuously since at least the 5th century. This was once the capital of the Kingdom of Strathclyde, one of the successor kingdoms of Roman Britain, a place where the last embers of a Roman-trained Christian civilization held on for generations after Rome itself had fallen. The kings who ruled from Dumbarton Rock were the heirs of a world that had already ended, maintaining the forms of an order that was dissolving around them, keeping the language and the law and the faith alive in a landscape that was changing faster than any single generation could fully absorb. The landscape around Dumbarton has been shaped by human presence for 4,000 years. There are standing stones in the hills. There are the remnants of crannogs, artificial islands built in the lochs, that date to the Bronze Age. There are medieval tower houses and Reformation-era churches and Victorian industrial heritage in approximately equal measure, laid on top of each other in the way that old places layer their histories, so that to walk through the countryside here is to move through time in a way that the newer parts of the world do not allow. The Bronze Age farmer and the Victorian industrialist and the modern walker occupy the same ground, successively and simultaneously, each one inheriting a landscape already dense with the meanings that previous generations left in it. The Overtoun estate sits slightly apart from all of this, in the way that grand private estates always sit slightly apart from the world around them. Its boundary walls were built to make a distinction between the estate and the village, between the family and the community, between the managed landscape inside and the wild country beyond. The woods that line the approach to the house are planted rather than natural, chosen for their visual effect, shaped by years of careful management into something that looks like wilderness but is not. This is a common feature of Scottish estate design in the Victorian period, the deliberate cultivation of a particular kind of beauty, scenic and controlled, the landscape as decoration rather than habitat. And yet the underlying landscape asserts itself, even here. The Overtoun burn does not behave like a decorative feature. It moves with the indifference of water that has been flowing through this valley for millennia before the estate existed and will continue flowing long after it is gone. The waterfall is not elegant. It is geological, a consequence of the hard and soft rock layers exposed by 10,000 years of erosion since the last ice age retreated. The bridge was built over it, and the bridge is beautiful, and the waterfall underneath it does not care. Overtoun House itself was built in 1862 by James White, a Glasgow chemical merchant who had made a considerable fortune and wanted somewhere to spend it. The chemical industry of Victorian Glasgow was not a gentle trade, it produced wealth on an enormous scale and environmental damage on an equal scale, and the men who ran it tended to distance themselves from the evidence of what they had done by building houses in the countryside and filling them with art and books and the other markers of refinement. James White built in the Scottish baronial style, grey stone, turrets, corbelled corners, the whole vocabulary of Victorian Gothic ambition. The house looks, from certain angles, less like a private home than like a minor castle, which was entirely the intention. After his death, the estate passed to his son John Campbell White, who was made Lord Overtoun in 1893, the first and only Baron Overtoun. John Campbell White was a philanthropist and evangelical Christian who spent a significant portion of his fortune on missionary work in Africa and on temperance campaigns in Scotland. He was, by the standards of his time and class, a genuinely religious man, not in the performative way of many Victorian philanthropists, but in the sense of someone who took the obligations of his faith seriously and acted on them at considerable personal cost. He funded schools and housing for workers in the Glasgow factories he had inherited. He was known, in his public life, as a man of principle. He was also, as a journalist named Robert Blatchford documented at length in the socialist newspaper Clarion in 1899, a man who presided over working conditions in those factories that made a mockery of his public reputation. Blatchford's exposé described 12-hour shifts, dangerous chemical exposure, wages that left workers unable to adequately house or feed their families, and a management culture that punished complaint. The contradiction between Lord Overtoun's philanthropic public persona and the conditions in his factories became something of a cause célèbre in Edwardian Glasgow, a useful illustration of the limits of Victorian charity as a substitute for structural change. Blatchford called him the Sunday philanthropist, generous in public, exploitative in private. Lord Overtoun died in 1908, aware that the version of himself he had worked to construct had been substantially revised by public scrutiny. The estate passed through several hands in the decades that followed. For a period during and after the Second World War it served as a maternity hospital, one of many country houses requisitioned by the state for medical use, the private spaces of the wealthy temporarily repurposed for the public good. Later it fell into disuse. By the 1990s the house was in serious disrepair, the grounds overgrown, the rooms stripped of their contents. A visitor in 1995 described it as a beautiful shell, the architecture intact, the spirit departed. The bridge, though, remained exactly as it had always been. This is worth noting. The house fell into ruin. The grounds were neglected. The estate's identity as a private domain dissolved. But the bridge stood through all of it, unchanged and unchanging, the grey granite unaffected by the fortunes of the family and the institution it had served. Some things resist time more stubbornly than others. Some things have purposes that outlast the purposes they were built for. In 1994, a local man named Kevin Moe threw his baby son from the bridge. He told police that the child was the Antichrist. The baby survived. Kevin Moe was convicted of attempted murder and committed to a psychiatric hospital. This incident is mentioned in almost every account of the Overtoun Bridge, and it is worth pausing on why. The incident was horrifying and isolated, a single act of violence by a man in the grip of a psychotic episode. It has nothing to do, statistically or causally, with the animal deaths. A person suffering from severe psychosis does not choose their location rationally. Kevin Moe could have gone anywhere. The fact that he went to the Overtoun Bridge proves nothing about the bridge. And yet something about placing it here feels correct. Something about the bridge seemed to reach, in that year, not just animals but a human mind at its most fractured and afraid. The delusion that the child was the Antichrist is a theological delusion, a belief structured around supernatural danger, around the idea that an ordinary human being contained within it something profoundly threatening to the cosmic order. And the place Kevin Moe chose to act on that delusion was a bridge that, for decades before and decades after, was pulling animals to their deaths for reasons no one could explain. We are not drawing a conclusion. We are noting a coincidence. The distinction between a place that produces unusual behavior and a place that attracts people who are already unusually disturbed is important, and we should not collapse it. But the coincidence is there, and it should be noted. The first recorded accounts of dogs jumping from the bridge date to the 1950s and 1960s, though local people suggest it had been happening for longer. The pattern, when researchers began to document it systematically, was remarkably consistent. Always from the same spot. Always the same parapet, the right-hand side of the bridge, looking toward the house, near the far end. Always in clear weather. Almost never in rain or heavy cloud. Almost always between the months of October and February, when the sky is low and grey and the shadows under the bridge stay dark through the middle of the day. Always Labradors. Always Spaniels. Always breeds with long noses, breeds for which scent is the primary sense, the primary way of reading and interpreting the world. Breeds whose noses are capable of picking up chemical information at concentration so low that our instruments can barely detect them. Breeds whose entire relationship with their environment is mediated by a sensory system that we can describe in laboratory terms without fully understanding what it is like to inhabit. Not, or almost never, short-nosed breeds. Not, or almost never, dogs in rain. Not, or almost never, from the other parapet. The pattern has the kind of specificity that rules out randomness. Whatever is happening at the Overtoun Bridge, it is not happening by accident. The number of documented incidents varies depending on the source. The most commonly cited figure is around 50 deaths and an additional 200 injuries over a 50-year period. Some researchers who have spent time in the area and spoken to local veterinarians put the number higher. The actual figure is probably impossible to determine, because not all incidents were reported to anyone. Many people who saw their dogs jump simply dealt with the aftermath privately, without contacting authorities or researchers, without adding their experience to any formal record. The incidents that are documented tend to cluster in the same months, the same weather conditions, the same location. The clustering is not the clustering of random events. It has a structure, and the structure points toward a cause, toward something specific about that specific parapet in those specific conditions, even if the cause itself remains unidentified. The parapet from which the dogs jump is not the highest point of the bridge, nor is it the most dramatic vantage point. It is a quiet, ordinary stretch of stone wall, approximately 50 centimeters high, low enough for a medium to large dog to rest its paws on comfortably, but high enough that it cannot step over by accident. A dog has to make a deliberate effort to get over it. It has to put its weight forward, past the point of balance, and commit to the fall. This is not the behavior of an animal that has lost its footing. This is not the behavior of an animal that has been startled or panicked into flight. According to every animal behavior specialist who has examined the witness accounts, this is the behavior of an animal that has decided to move in a particular direction and is following through on that decision. The decision is the mystery, not the mechanics, not the opportunity. The decision. What the decision is based on is what we cannot say. David Sands, an animal behaviorist, visited the bridge in 2006 as part of a Channel 5 documentary investigation. He brought with him a professional tracking team and several dogs of different breeds, and they tested the bridge systematically, walking dogs along its full length, observing their reactions at different points, monitoring their behavior for signs of agitation, fixation, or confusion. Most of the dogs showed no unusual behavior along most of the bridge's length. They walked, sniffed, looked around, behaved as dogs on walks behave. The bridge, to most of the dogs, in most of its length, was unremarkable. But at the right-hand parapet, near the far end, several of the dogs showed a sudden, focused interest. Their heads went down. Their noses pressed to the stone. They pulled toward the edge with a purpose that their handlers had to actively resist. One dog, briefly, placed its front paws on the parapet and looked over. Sand's conclusion was that the dogs were smelling something powerful enough to override their usual caution about heights. His theory was that mink or mice living in the undergrowth below the bridge were producing a scent that certain dog breeds found irresistible, and that in their fixation on that scent they simply failed to register the height beneath them. American mink were introduced to Scotland in the 1950s, the same decade in which the first documented incidents at the Overtoun Bridge occurred. They were brought to fur farms across the country, escaped in large numbers, and established themselves throughout the river systems of western Scotland. Mink produce a powerful musk that can persist on stone and vegetation for extended periods. They are secretive animals, low to the ground, inclined to inhabit the kinds of dark, damp spaces that exist beneath stone bridges over fast-moving water. The creatures themselves tend to live in riverbanks and under bridges, precisely the kind of habitat that exists beneath the Overtoun Bridge, precisely the kind of habitat invisible from the surface but accessible by smell to a dog with its paws on the parapet. It is a reasonable theory. It may even be partly correct. The mink are there. The scent is probably there. The smell of mink is known to be deeply compelling to certain breeds of dog in a way that can override normal behavior. There are documented cases of dogs pursuing mink scent trails into dangerous situations without apparent awareness of the danger. But the theory does not explain the specific spot. The mink live beneath the bridge generally, not only beneath the right-hand parapet. If the issue were simply the presence of mink scent, we would expect incidents distributed across the full length of the bridge, concentrated wherever the scent happened to be strongest on a given day. What we see instead is a pattern with a fixed location, the same parapet, year after year, across multiple decades and dozens of different animals. It does not explain the weather pattern. Mink are presumably present regardless of whether the sky is clear or overcast. The concentration of incidents in clear weather is consistent with scent dispersal. Dry, still air does carry scent differently than wet air, but the specificity of the weather effect is stronger than simple scent dispersal would produce. And it does not explain the survivors who return. If the mechanism were purely olfactory, purely a question of a smell so compelling that it overrides caution, then the experience of falling 15 meters and hitting rocks should constitute a powerful aversive stimulus. Dogs learn from painful consequences. They do not typically repeat experiences that resulted in broken legs and hospitalization. The returning survivors are not behaving like animals who were momentarily overwhelmed by a scent. They are behaving like animals drawn back to something by something that survived the fall in a way that pain and fear did not. And it does not explain the feeling. Everyone who has spent significant time at the bridge reports it. Not all of them want to. The researchers and journalists and documentary makers who visit tend to arrive with the assumption that they will feel nothing, that the story is interesting as an animal behavior puzzle and nothing more. Some of them leave with that assumption intact. But many of them do not. The feeling is not dramatic. It is not the gothic sensation of dread that ghost stories produce, not the cold that has nothing to do with temperature, not the sudden certainty that something malevolent is present. It is something quieter and stranger, a quality of attention, a sense that the place is aware of you in the way that a room is aware when someone enters it. A feeling that something is present at the bridge that is not visible, not audible, not identifiable by any conventional sense, but that is, unmistakably, there. Different people describe it differently. Some call it a heaviness. Some call it a watchfulness. Some say only that they felt uncomfortable, in a way that they could not explain and that did not correspond to any rational assessment of the situation. A few people, a small minority, report nothing unusual at all, and walk away from the bridge with their skepticism fully intact and their curiosity fully satisfied. We will not call it a ghost. That word has become too small and too specific for what we are describing, too tied to a particular cultural framework, too narrowly focused on the idea of a deceased individual's persisting consciousness. What we are describing is something more like a quality of the place itself, an atmosphere that is not metaphorical but physical, that affects different people in different ways and that some people do not notice at all. Whether that atmosphere is evidence of something real, or whether it is what happens to a human mind standing at a place where so many animals have died, whether it is an external phenomenon or an internal response to a powerful story, is a question we cannot answer from here. But we should walk further. The night is young, and the bridge is patient. In 2005, the story of the Overtoun Bridge reached a national audience in Britain through a BBC programme, and the response was unlike almost anything the programme had generated before. The letters and emails came from across the country and beyond, from people who had walked the bridge and felt something, from people who had lost dogs there, from veterinarians who had treated animals brought down from the falls, from physicists and geologists and folklorists and theologians who saw in the story questions relevant to their own fields of study. What was unusual about this response was not its volume but its tone. Most of the people who wrote in were not sensation seekers. They were not trying to make the story stranger than it was. They were people who had encountered something they could not explain and were relieved to find that others had encountered it too. There was in the correspondence a collective sense of validation, of a privately held experience being publicly acknowledged. The subtext of many of the letters was something like, "I saw this and I didn't know what to do with it, and now I find that other people have seen the same thing and they didn't know what to do with it either, and there is a strange comfort in that." This is worth noting. The Overtoun Bridge is not a story that lives primarily in tabloids or paranormal forums. It is a story that lives in the experience of ordinary people who walked their dogs in the west of Scotland and saw something they could not account for. The formal investigations are a response to those experiences, not the source of them. The story would exist without the investigations. The investigations exist because of the story. Let us go through what has been formally investigated, and let us be precise about what each investigation found and what it failed to find. The Geological and Environmental Survey. In 2006, in conjunction with the Channel 5 documentary, a team of environmental scientists and geologists undertook a comprehensive assessment of the Overtoun estate. They were looking for anything in the physical environment that might produce a localized effect on the behavior of living organisms, unusual mineral deposits, electromagnetic anomalies, underground water sources producing specific gases, radon concentration, geological features that might produce infrasound or other physical effects at specific frequencies. The survey found nothing significantly unusual. The granite of the bridge and the surrounding rock is typical of the geological region, a Caledonian intrusive formation, similar to the bedrock across much of the western Scottish Highlands. There are no large metallic ore deposits beneath the bridge site that might produce significant magnetic anomalies. The radon levels are consistent with background levels for the area, above the levels typical of lowland England, as is common in granite-based geology, but not at levels associated with health risks or unusual biological effects. The bridge is not situated at a geological fault line or any other feature associated with unusual ground activity. This finding of nothing unusual is significant, but not in the way it is sometimes taken to be. A finding of nothing unusual in the parameters we measure does not mean that nothing unusual is present. It means that nothing unusual is present within the sensitivity of our instruments and the range of phenomena we know to look for. The history of science contains many examples of phenomena that were physically real before we had the instruments to detect them. Radon itself was not measurable until the appropriate detectors existed. The electromagnetic fields that affect bird navigation were not measurable in the relevant way until the late 20th century. A dog sensory system is not calibrated to human sensitivities. It operates in ranges, chemical, acoustic, possibly electromagnetic, that our current survey instruments are not designed to detect. The absence of a finding in a survey designed for human-scale phenomena is not evidence that nothing is present at the scale that matters to dogs. It is evidence that we looked and did not find, which is a narrower and more provisional claim. The Mink and Wildlife Survey. A separate survey was conducted of the wildlife living in and around the bridge structure, the rocks below, the riverbanks of the Overtoun burn, the undergrowth on either side. The survey confirmed the presence of American mink in the area, along with field mice, voles, and other small mammals. The mink population was found to be particularly concentrated in the area beneath the right-hand parapet, the same side from which the dogs consistently jump. This is the strongest physical evidence for the scent theory, and it should be taken seriously. The concentration of mink precisely beneath the jump point is not coincidental, or at least, it is difficult to argue that it is. The question that remains is whether mink scent, however powerful, is sufficient to cause dogs not merely to show interest but to override the survival instinct entirely and step off the edge of a wall into a 15-meter fall. Animal behavior specialists are divided on this. Some argue that in the context of a breed with an extremely powerful scent drive, a Labrador or a Spaniel following a compelling scent trail, the override is entirely plausible. They cite documented cases of dogs following scent trails into roads, rivers, and other clearly dangerous situations without apparent awareness of the danger. The argument is that scent, at sufficient intensity, becomes the whole world for a scent-oriented dog, and that whatever falls outside the zone of olfactory attention ceases to register with sufficient urgency to override the drive. Others argue that this explanation, while plausible for a single incident, does not adequately account for the consistency of the pattern. If the issue were simply a powerful scent overriding spatial awareness, we would expect a much wider distribution of jumping locations, along the bank of the burn where dogs can also smell mink, along the lower edges of the estate where the same animals live, at any number of points where mink or mice are present in the Dumbarton area. The remarkable specificity of the Overtoun incidents, concentrated at a single parapet of a single bridge over several decades, suggests either something more focused than ambient scent or something additional operating alongside the scent that concentrates its effect. The parapet height theory. One detail that researchers find physically significant is the exact height and shape of the parapet at the jumping point. It stands approximately 50 centimeters from the bridge surface, precisely the height at which a medium to large dog can comfortably rest its front paws and look over, but high enough that it cannot step over without a significant forward lean. The design is accidental. It reflects Victorian bridge building convention, not any intention to create an accessible ledge for dogs, but it creates a very specific physical affordance. A dog at that parapet is in a body position that combines engagement and commitment, paws on stone, weight shifted forward, head over the edge. It is a position from which the natural next step, if something compelling is sensed below, is to continue forward. From the dog's eye view, at parapet height, the undergrowth on the lower side of the bridge obscures much of the drop. A dog placing its paws on the parapet and looking over would see the tops of bushes and vegetation, not an open fall. The 15-meter drop to the rocks is not visible from that position in the way it would be to a human looking over the side of the bridge. This detail has been used to support the scent theory. The dogs cannot see the fall, they can smell what is below, and they go toward the smell without understanding the gap between them and it. It is a sobering observation. The bridge may not be calling them. The bridge may simply be hiding what it is. The survivor behavior revisited. The most difficult data point in the entire body of evidence is not the initial jump but what happens afterward. Dogs that survive the fall, and many do, because the burn and the rocks, while dangerous, are not invariably fatal, and because dogs' skeletal and muscular structures absorb impact differently from ours, are brought to local veterinary practices in varying states of injury. Broken limbs, fractured ribs, internal bruising, shock. They are treated and they recover. Most of them go on to live normal lives. Several, in the accounts documented by researchers and veterinarians, have not. Some of them, in the weeks and months after recovery, return to the bridge with their owners. And they return to the same parapet. And they jump again. This has been documented in multiple cases by multiple independent sources, including veterinarians who have seen the same animals twice. It is not one unusual dog with an unusual psychology. It appears to be a pattern, and the pattern is deeply resistant to any purely olfactory explanation. What does it mean for an animal to survive a 15-meter fall, recover fully, and then return to the site of that fall and repeat the experience? In human terms, we would reach for words like compulsion or addiction or fixation, words that describe a drive that overrides rational assessment of consequences. But these are human words, built around human experience, and the question of whether they accurately describe what is happening in the mind of a returning dog is one we cannot answer. What the behavior tells us, at minimum, is that the fall itself did not extinguish whatever caused the first jump. The experience of falling 15 meters and hitting rocks and recovering in a veterinary clinic did not produce, in these animals, the kind of aversive conditioning that such an experience would be expected to produce. The pull of the bridge was, apparently, stronger than the memory of the fall. Whatever the dogs are responding to when they return to that parapet, it is something that persists across the interruption of catastrophic injury and recovery. It is something that survives. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, whose work on morphic resonance and animal cognition has made him a significant and controversial figure in British science, has written about the Overtoun Bridge in the context of his broader interest in what he calls the extended mind, the idea that consciousness and perception are not confined to the skull but extend into and interact with the physical environment. He is careful, in writing about Overtoun, not to make supernatural claims. What he suggests is that our framework for understanding the relationship between animals and their environments may be inadequate, that there are forms of perception, forms of environmental influence, that we have not yet learned to measure or name. This is not a fringe position in the history of science. The history of science is, in part, a history of phenomena that were real before they were understood, of effects that were observed and dismissed as inexplicable before the framework for explaining them had been developed. Electromagnetism was observed as a physical phenomenon for centuries before Maxwell gave it mathematical form. The germ theory of disease was resisted for decades by a medical establishment that could not integrate it with existing frameworks. The reality of continental drift was dismissed by most geologists until the mid-20th century. What we cannot currently explain is therefore not real. The history of knowledge is, in significant part, a history of learning to take observations seriously that previous frameworks had no room for. In the specific case of the Overtoun Bridge, Sheldrake has pointed to the consistency of the phenomenon, its persistence across decades, its specificity of location and conditions, its selectivity for certain dog breeds, as suggesting something more structured than random environmental variation. Random environmental variation produces random effects. What we see at Overtoun produces consistent, patterned effects. The pattern implies a structure. The structure implies a cause. The cause has not been identified. The Celtic thin places. The land around Overtoun has a long history of what the Gaelic-speaking inhabitants of Western Scotland would have called kaolate, thin places. The term has been borrowed extensively by contemporary writers on Celtic spirituality, often in ways that strip it of its original precision and load it with a vague romanticism that its traditional usage did not have. In its original context, kaolate is not a metaphor. It is not a way of saying that a place is beautiful or spiritually significant in a general sense. It describes a quality of specific physical locations, a perceptible difference in the quality of attention or presence at a particular spot, as if the ordinary density of the world were somehow reduced there, as if whatever lies beyond the visible were more accessible from that point than from others. The Kilpatrick Hills and the area around the Overtoun burn have been considered such places for as long as records reach, and the records here reach back further than most. The springs that feed the burn were regarded as sacred in the early medieval period and probably long before. The pattern of votive offerings found in springs and watercourses across early Scotland suggests a widespread practice of considering flowing water as a boundary between worlds. Not metaphorically a boundary. Literally a boundary, a physical place where the membrane between the ordinary world and whatever lay beyond it was thinner, more permeable, more susceptible to communication and passage. The waterfall over which the Overtoun Bridge now stands is not any waterfall. It is a place where water, moving, alive, between states, marks a threshold that people in this landscape have been acknowledging for at least 1,000 years and probably much longer. The bridge was built across it, with Victorian indifference to what had been there before, and the threshold is still there, as it has always been, whether or not the bridge acknowledges it. What is a thin place, more precisely? The concept appears in many traditions across the world, not only the Celtic. It is not, in any of its serious usages, a supernatural claim in the sense of a claim about magic or ghosts or the violation of physical law. It is a claim about the distribution of a quality of presence, of accessibility, of the permeability of certain kinds of experience across the physical landscape. The claim is that this quality is not uniformly distributed. That some places have more of it than others. That standing in certain spots, a person or an animal encounters a version of the world that is subtly different from the one they encounter elsewhere. This is not a claim that can be easily tested. It is not falsifiable in the strict sense. But it is also not obviously wrong. The landscape is not homogeneous. Different places have different qualities, different acoustics, different atmospheres, different concentrations of various physical and chemical properties. The idea that some places affect the experience of the beings who visit them in ways that our current instruments cannot fully measure is not, in principle, an extraordinary claim. It is a fairly modest one, stated cautiously. Let us spend some time with the people who were there. Not the researchers, not the documentary makers, not the scientists with their instruments. The people who were walking their dogs on an ordinary day and saw something that changed, in a quiet and permanent way, how they thought about the world. Alice Trevorrow walked her golden retriever, a 6-year-old female named Bramble, across the Overtoun Bridge on a Tuesday morning in October 2001. The day was clear and cold, with frost on the grass and the Overtoun burn running low and dark below. It was a route Alice had taken many times. She lived near the estate and used the grounds regularly for walking in all seasons. Bramble had crossed the bridge dozens of times over the years and had never behaved unusually on it or near it. She was a calm, well-trained dog, familiar with the landscape and comfortable in it. That morning, near the right-hand parapet at the far end of the bridge, Bramble stopped. Her nose went to the stone. Her tail dropped from its usual carried position to something lower and more focused, the posture of a dog tracking, a dog that has found something significant and is processing it. She moved to the edge of the parapet in what Alice later described, more than once and in consistent terms, as a purposeful, calm walk. Not excited, not frightened, not confused, deliberate. The word Alice kept returning to was deliberate. Before Alice could reach her, Bramble had placed her front paws on the parapet, leaned forward, and fallen. Alice described the moment of watching her dog fall as one of the most surreal of her life. Not primarily because it happened quickly, it did, but because of the quality of deliberateness that preceded it. Bramble did not slip. She did not stumble. She did not startle. She walked to the edge with the purposeful, focused manner of a dog that has decided to go somewhere, and she went. There was nothing in her demeanor, Alice said, that suggested anything other than intentional forward movement. Bramble fell 12 meters and landed in the burn. She survived, with a broken foreleg and bruised ribs. Alice climbed down the steep bank, a scramble through wet undergrowth on an icy autumn morning, not a trivial undertaking, and found her conscious, wet, and shaking but alive. She was taken to a vet in Dumbarton. The vet, a woman who had been practicing in the area for 15 years, told Alice, without apparent surprise, that this was not the first time she had treated a dog from that bridge. She had heard about the pattern from colleagues. She had treated several animals herself. She said she did not know what caused it, but that it was known in the local veterinary community as a recurring thing, not frequent, not predictable, but consistent enough that it had become part of the local professional understanding of the area. She had learned not to try to explain it to clients because there was no explanation she felt confident giving. She simply treated the injuries, asked about the location, nodded when it was confirmed, and moved on. This detail, the veterinarian's matter-of-fact acknowledgement, her settled acceptance of the phenomenon as real and unexplained, is one of the most striking in all the accounts from the bridge. It speaks to a community that has lived with this reality for long enough that the unusual has become normal. Not explained. Not resolved. Just accepted as part of the landscape, the way that certain roads are known to flood in particular weather, or certain hillsides are known to be unstable in heavy rain. Something that requires adjusting to, even if it cannot be accounted for. Gordon Sharp lost his black Labrador, a 10-year-old male named Ramsey, at the bridge in March of 2004. Gordon had owned Ramsey since puppyhood and described him as a calm, experienced dog, steady temperament, excellent recall, no history of erratic behavior or unusual anxiety. He had spent his life walking in the hills around Dumbarton and had navigated dozens of bridges, stiles, streams, and waterways without incident. He was not a dog that got into trouble. He was the kind of dog that experienced walkers tend to describe as reliable. On the day in question, they were walking a route through the Overtoun estate that they had walked many times. The day was clear and dry, with a pale winter light coming through the trees. Gordon was behind Ramsey by perhaps 10 meters, not an unusual distance, and well within the range at which he could observe and call the dog back if needed. At the far end of the bridge, near the right-hand parapet, Ramsey stopped. Gordon called to him. Ramsey did not respond. He moved to the wall, placed his front paws on the stone, and looked over. Gordon was running by this point, calling his name. He was perhaps 4 meters away when Ramsey jumped. Ramsey died on the rocks below. Gordon Sharp has spoken about this incident many times in the years since, at length and with evident care. He speaks about it with a clarity and precision that comes from having turned it over in his mind for a long time, from having replayed it thousands of times, from having examined every detail for whatever it might reveal. He resists easy explanations in both directions. He does not claim the bridge is haunted, and he does not accept the mink theory on the evidence of what he saw. He is a practical man who prefers to stay close to the observable facts. What he keeps coming back to, the detail that none of the standard explanations satisfactorily accounts for, is the quality of Ramsey's attention in the last moments. He was looking at something, Gordon says. Not smelling something, not hearing something, looking. He was looking over the edge of the wall with the specific kind of focused, engaged attention that he showed when he had spotted a bird in the distance, or a rabbit on a hillside. The kind of attention that is not exploratory but responsive, not seeking, but reacting to something already found. The kind of attention that means something is there. Something was there, Gordon says. I don't know what it was. I may never know what it was. But something was there, and he saw it, and he went to it. These are 2 stories from among dozens. The accounts share common features: the clear weather, the specific parapet, the quality of deliberateness that witnesses consistently describe. They share something else as well, which is harder to name but which emerges from reading them carefully and at length. The dogs are not afraid. In every account, in every witness statement, from every person who was present at the moment of a jump, the animal's demeanor in the moments before is described as calm, focused, interested, not distressed, not confused, not panicked. Whatever they are responding to at the Overtoun parapet, it is not something that frightens them. It is something that draws them. The distinction matters. Fear produces one kind of behavior: flight, trembling, seeking proximity to the owner, avoidance. What the Overtoun dogs show is something different. They show the behavior of an animal moving towards something they want to reach. The local community has developed its own relationship with the bridge over the decades, one that is considerably more nuanced than either the scientific skepticism or the paranormal enthusiasm that the story attracts from outside. Among the people who live and walk near Overtoun, the people who know the bridge not as an internet curiosity or a documentary subject but as a feature of their daily landscape, the bridge occupies a kind of middle ground. It is real and unexplained and simply there, in the way that certain features of any landscape become simply part of what the landscape is. Not understood. Not dismissed. Accommodated. People keep their dogs on leads when crossing the bridge. This is the standard advice given by locals to visitors, the piece of practical wisdom that circulates through the community without requiring any particular explanation of what it is protecting against. People who have lost dogs there sometimes avoid the bridge entirely, taking the longer route through the estate, going around rather than over. People who have walked it hundreds of times without incident continue to do so, reasonably confident in the statistics but alert in a way they might not be on other bridges. The bridge is, for its regular users, neither haunted nor innocent. It is a place that requires attention. This practical wisdom: keep your dog close on the bridge, watch what it's doing, don't let it run ahead, is not superstition. It is the accumulated observational knowledge of a community that has been watching this place for a long time, knowledge that precedes the documentaries and the scientific investigations and the media coverage that made the bridge internationally known. It is what you know when you live somewhere, when the place has had time to teach you what it requires. The Reverend James Curry, who served for many years in a parish near Dumbarton, wrote and spoke about the bridge from a perspective that he described as both theological and pastoral, by which he meant that he was concerned not only with what the bridge was, metaphysically, but with what it did to the people connected to it. He was a careful thinker, not given to spectacular claims or sensational interpretation. He had spent decades in ministry in a community that included people who had lost dogs at the bridge, and he had observed, over that time, the particular quality of distress that those losses produced, a distress that was not entirely like the ordinary grief of pet loss, that contained within it something additional, something harder to name. He was careful, in his public statements, not to claim that the bridge was cursed or haunted in any specific theological sense, not to invoke the vocabulary of supernatural evil that would, he felt, both misrepresent the phenomenon and shut down the kind of serious attention it deserved. He said instead that there are places in the physical world that seem to concentrate something, the residue of events, the quality of attention that has been focused there over time, the accumulated weight of whatever has been brought to and taken from a particular spot. He said that dismissing this as superstition was a failure of both imagination and observation, and that the long human tradition of marking such places as sacred or cautioned was not the product of ignorance but of watching, of paying attention to what places do to the beings who move through them. There are things about the Overtoun Bridge that we know. We know when it was built and by whom and for what purpose. We know its dimensions and the composition of its stone. We know the wildlife in its immediate environment and the geology of the ground beneath it. We know that the incidents of dogs jumping from it have been occurring for at least 70 years and possibly longer. We know the specific parapet from which they jump. We know the weather conditions under which it most often happens. We know the breeds most often involved. These are established facts, documented by multiple independent sources, not seriously disputed. There are things we do not know. We do not know why the right parapet and not the left. We do not know why clear weather and not rain. We do not know why long-nosed breeds and not all breeds. We do not know what the dogs are responding to, whether it is a scent, a sound, a sight, or something for which we do not have a word. We do not know why the survivors return. We do not know why, after decades of investigation by people with significant expertise and resources, the pattern persists and the explanation does not. And beneath these specific unknowns is a question that the bridge forces on anyone who spends time with it, a question that is not quite scientific and not quite theological, but something that sits between the two, something more fundamental than either. What do animals know that we do not? This is not a naive question. It is not the question of someone who has never thought carefully about what animals are and how they work. It is the question that emerges at the end of a serious engagement with the evidence, the question that remains when the specific theories have been tested against the full body of facts and found incomplete. It is the question that the bridge, patiently, keeps returning us to. The sensory lives of dogs are, by any measure, extraordinary. Their olfactory systems contain roughly 300 million receptor cells, compared to our 6 million. They can detect odors at concentrations billions of times lower than we can perceive. Their noses function at a level of sensitivity that is difficult to intuitively grasp, that exceeds our best chemical instruments in certain domains. They can hear frequencies well above and below the human auditory range, which means they are receiving acoustic information from the environment that is simply not available to us. They detect magnetic fields and appear to use them for orientation. They anticipate changes in air pressure before storms arrive, in ways that suggest they are reading the atmosphere on a level of detail we cannot access. They smell the biochemical changes in human bodies that precede epileptic seizures, sometimes minutes before the seizure begins, before any symptom is visible to another human being. They identify certain cancers by center to stage when imaging technology has not yet found them. They live, in short, in a version of the world that is richer, more detailed, and more crowded with information than ours. The world we inhabit is a simplified version of the world they inhabit, filtered through sensory systems far less capable than theirs, processed by a brain that prioritizes certain kinds of information and discards others. What they perceive in the gap between their sensory world and ours, whether there is anything there that would matter to us, if we could only detect it, is not a question we can dismiss without some humility about the limits of our own perception. The Gaelic traditions of Scotland, the traditions of the people who named the hills and the burns and the standing stones of the Kilpatrick area long before the Overtoun estate existed, assigned to dogs a particular sensitivity to the unseen world. In these traditions, dogs were liminal creatures. They moved between the world of the living and the world that lay beneath and beyond it. They could hear what human ears could not hear. They could see what human eyes could not see. They were, in the cosmology that produced these stories, trusted guides and reliable witnesses precisely because they were not confined to the ordinary world in the way that human beings were. A dog that behaved unusually at a particular place was not malfunctioning. It was perceiving. Something was there, and the dog was the instrument by which the human being could know that something was there, even if neither of them could name it. We have tended to regard these traditions as the projections of pre-scientific minds onto animals that were simply responding to sensory information in ways their human companions could not understand. The dog that behaved oddly at a particular spot was detecting a sound, a scent, a pressure change that its superior senses had picked up and that its human companions had missed entirely. The apparent supernatural was the actually sensory superior. This is a plausible account, and for many individual cases it is probably correct. But the Overtoun Bridge has been investigated with the tools of modern science, and the tools have not found the answer. The mink are there, the scent is probably there, and dogs are still going over the wall in a manner that every witness describes as deliberate and every specialist describes as beyond what simple olfactory override can fully account for. The gap between what the science finds and what the dogs appear to be doing remains open. And the question of what is in that gap, whether it is something we have not yet measured, or something we have not yet imagined, is the question that the bridge keeps asking. In 2007, Overtoun House was purchased by a Christian charity that undertook a major restoration project. The work took several years and considerable resources, and transformed the house from a state of serious disrepair to something approaching its original condition. The roof was repaired, the interior restored, the grounds cleared and maintained. The house is now used for retreats, conferences, and community events. People walk through its restored rooms who know nothing of its history, who have no connection to Lord Overtoun or the Kevin Moe incident or the bridge or the dogs. For them, it is simply a beautiful Scottish baronial house in pleasant grounds. The bridge is still there, as it has always been. The stone is the same stone. The waterfall is the same waterfall. The particular parapet has not been modified in any way, not fenced, not raised, not marked with any sign or warning. It looks now as it looked in 1895, as it looked in 1959, as it looked the morning Bramble jumped and the morning Ramsay jumped and every morning in between and after. And dogs still jump. Not every week, not every month, but in the years since the investigations and the documentaries and the media coverage that made the bridge internationally known, the incidents have continued. The knowledge has not protected the animals. The cameras and spectrometers and behavior assessments and television crews have not changed what the bridge does. Thousands of people visit the bridge each year now, aware of its reputation, watching their dogs carefully, keeping them on leads as a precaution. And still, occasionally, a dog slips past that precaution, or the lead comes off at the wrong moment, or someone who doesn't know the story walks their dog across without particular attention. Whatever calls to the animals at that parapet is not disturbed by our attention. It is not impressed by our instruments or our theories or our need to explain it. It has been doing what it does for as long as anyone can remember, and it does not appear to be stopping. The investigations have not changed it. The publicity has not changed it. The accumulated weight of human bewilderment directed at it has not changed it. It simply continues. There is something almost consoling about this, in a strange way. We live in an era that is confident, sometimes recklessly confident, in its ability to explain things. We have instruments of extraordinary precision and theoretical frameworks of enormous power. We have decoded the genome. We have photographed black holes. We have sent objects to the edge of the solar system and watched them cross the boundary of the sun's influence into interstellar space. The scope of what we understand has expanded beyond anything that previous centuries could have imagined. And there is a bridge in Scotland that we cannot explain. Not because we haven't tried. Not because the evidence is insufficient or the investigators incompetent. But because the phenomenon, whatever it is, has so far exceeded the reach of our tools and our frameworks. It has declined to be explained. It has remained, stubbornly and patiently, itself. And in remaining itself, in resisting the reduction to mechanism that we bring to every mystery, it maintains something that is increasingly rare in the modern world, a genuine, well-documented, rigorously investigated mystery that is still, after decades of attention, a mystery. Tonight, as you settle toward sleep, you might think about what it means to live in a body that knows things your mind does not. To receive signals you cannot consciously interpret. To feel a pull you cannot explain and follow it anyway, past the point where reason would say stop. We are not so different from the dogs at Overtoun, in the end. We follow things we do not understand all the time. We feel drawn toward places, people, ideas, callings, not for reasons we can articulate, but because something older and more insistent than thought tells us to go. We make decisions that bypass the rational and then construct the rational afterward to explain what we have already done. We are moved by things we cannot name. We go toward things we cannot fully see. Perhaps the dogs at Overtoun are simply more honest about this than we are. They feel the call, and they go. They do not construct a theory first. They do not wait for the explanation. They do not check whether what they feel is supported by evidence and peer-reviewed literature and the consensus of specialists. They feel the call, and they go. Or perhaps it is simpler than all of this. Perhaps it is a bridge, an ascent, and an unfortunate combination of low parapets and powerful noses, and the mystery is only a mystery because we have not yet found the precise mechanism, and when we find it we will look back on the decades of speculation with a kind of fond embarrassment. Both of these things are possible. The world permits both. Either way, they go. The burn runs on beneath the bridge. The waterfall falls. The granite holds its shape in the grey Scottish light. The parapet is where it has always been. And somewhere in the west of Scotland, tonight, there is a dog that has not yet been to that bridge. Sleep well.